Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History as we look at the first three presidents of the 20th century, often viewed as our progressive presidents. Well, when the 20th century first began, the president was still William McKinley, the last Civil War veteran to be president, a conservative, gold standard, high tariff Republican. And then he was assassinated by an anarchist. His vice president was Theodore Roosevelt. And his presidency is often seen as the beginning of a fourth two-party system in America, in which both major parties were split internally between progressive and conservative factions, with, in some cases, progressives of one party working with progressives of the other to push some reform they supported, and conservatives of one party working with conservatives of the other to block changes or pass other laws. And this system would last with, at some points, progressives dominant, at some point conservatives dominant, from probably 1901 to 1933. Well, Theodore Roosevelt was known as Teddy to the public, Teddy being short for Theodore. In private, he didn't like the nickname Teddy, but wasn't going to complain to the public. His own family called him Thee, as short for Theodore. He was also often known as TR, the first president to be widely known by his initials, and was the youngest man ever to become president, at least so far, at the age of 42. Again, he was a progressive. He'd been police commissioner of New York City, where he was inspired by Jacob Riis to clean up corruption and promote cleaning up the slums as well. He promoted efficiency amongst the New York City police. They hated having him as commissioner because he'd walk around in the middle of the night and make sure the cops were actually on the beat doing their job and not sitting in a cafe having a donut and coffee. He'd been involved in politics in the New York State Assembly when he was young, but in his 20s he suffered a great personal tragedy. His wife and his mother died on the same day. And he dealt with that as a man should deal with such a thing, by never speaking of it again, going out west and becoming a cowboy. Where he was a cattle rancher in South Dakota until a great die-up destroyed most of his herds, and he returned back east. Out west, Roosevelt learned to love the outdoors and to love hunting. Oh, he really enjoyed hunting since he was young. I'm sure it was terrifying to be one of his neighbors in Manhattan, though. When he was real young, he liked to shoot birds with his rifle. Before they knew he needed glasses, it must have been terrifying to live nearby. Although at one point as president, he refused to shoot a caged bear as a photo opportunity, saying it wasn't sporting to shoot a caged bear. And after that, they called stuffed bears teddy bears after Teddy Roosevelt. Right before the Spanish-American War broke out, he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, being a big supporter of the war. He immediately resigned to recruit and lead the Rough Riders in Cuba. He returned from Cuba and as a war hero was elected governor of New York, where he tried to clean up the state until the Republican Party bosses there arranged for him to become vice president, hoping he would vanish in that thankless job. Roosevelt was probably a genius, possibly the smartest man to have been president. He used two secretaries at once while he was governor of New York, one to dictate state business to, the other so he could dictate the best-selling books that he wrote in his spare time, both from the same office. He was full of energy, drank several gallons of coffee a day. A foreign diplomat, I think the British ambassador, once warned another, he must understand the President of the United States is 8 years old. People would come to see the president, and he would say, "Let's go for a walk." And even if they were wearing their formal clothes with their gloves and spats and everything, a walk might turn out to be a half-day hike through the woods and swamps around Washington, D.C. One time he insisted they all go skinny dipping in the Potomac River. All the French ambassador kept his gloves on because he didn't want to be completely naked if they met a woman. I'm not sure what the gloves would do, but I guess it was the principle of the thing. Roosevelt expanded the power of the presidency, which he said was a bully pulpit. And it is a term still used today, although not quite as he meant it. As language, of course, has changed a bit since the early 20th century, Bully in those days could mean what it means today in bullying someone, but bully was also slang in the late early 1900s, meaning excellent or outstanding, as cool would come to be in the mid-20th century. And what is a pulpit? Piece of furniture. Where do you find the pulpit? In the church. The pulpit is where the preacher stands to preach to the people. And the presidency, Roosevelt said, was a bully pulpit, an outstanding place from which to preach the gospel of progressive reform to the American people, in a way using the presidency to convince the American people to support his policies, and thus put pressure on Congress to do so as well. And he called his plan the Square Deal. Square in those days meaning fair and honest. A square deal, based, he said, on giving everyone a fair chance. And Roosevelt, in the process, would make the presidency once again the strongest office in the federal government, as Lincoln had done, as Jackson had done, but as most presidents of the 19th century had not. Indeed, Roosevelt sometimes seen as having created the modern presidency. Roosevelt said, claiming it was a West African proverb, that a man should speak softly but carry a big stick. After all, if people know you'll back up what you'll say, you don't have to shout and bluster and carry on. And people knew Roosevelt would do what he said. And in some of the big disputes of the period between labor and bosses, he would take on the unions, but also the trusts. One of the first major crises of Roosevelt's presidency came in 1902 in the anthracite coal mines of western Pennsylvania, where anthracite coal miners belonging to the United Mine Workers of America wanted an 8-hour workday and a 20% pay raise. They had not had a raise in years. The bosses completely ignored them, refusing to negotiate whatsoever, knowing they had built up enough coal reserves to last for several months, and once the coal runs low, they can just raise the price of what's left. So in May, the miners went on strike. Anthracite coal, by the way, is the cleanest burning form of coal, relatively speaking. And one of the few early anti-pollution laws, some cities required that people who burned coal for heat, as many people did, burn anthracite coal. So this is something that would directly affect consumers once the weather turned cold, which might be for a while. The miners went on strike in May of 1902. In June, other workers in the area went on sympathy strikes. The bosses tried to hire scabs, but the miners chased them off. They sent in the police, the Pennsylvania National Guard, private detectives, all trying to break the strike. None of them successfully. There was some violence. A few people were killed. And they feared that violence would break out on a large scale, as often happened out west when the Western Federation of Miners led strikes. And there is the fact that in the summer this doesn't matter so much, but in the winter a coal famine would be a fearful thing. And so Roosevelt felt he had to act, and threatened to use the U.S. Army. Now in the past, when the U.S. government got involved at all, it had always been to break the strike. But Roosevelt wasn't going to do that immediately. Rather, he first approached the mine owners and asked them to listen to the miners' complaints. But when they refused, he said he would send in the army, take over the mines, and run them himself. He would put the workers back to work, but they'd be working for him and not the bosses. And this scared both sides badly enough that both the mine owners and the unions agreed to allow a special commission to find a solution. And the strike ended in October of 1902 while the commission began their negotiations, and just in time to start mining coal before winter set in. It took the commission 3 months to reach a conclusion. In the end, they split the difference. The miners wanted a 20% raise and were offered 0. They got a 10% raise. The 10-hour working day was lowered to 9 rather than 8 hours. The miners felt they had won a victory. Although not a complete one, the mine owners were not required to officially recognize the Union as a group to negotiate with in the future. But Roosevelt had at least worked out a deal rather than simply breaking the strike, being seen by the miners overall as a win for them. And seeing how important these issues were in modern society, in February of 1903, right after the commission finished their work, Roosevelt created a new cabinet department, the Department of Commerce and Labor. 10 years later, that would be split into two separate cabinet positions in 1913, a Department of Commerce and a Department of Labor, again to deal with labor and business issues in the future. Now, for many years, what particular type of company had farmers in particular seen as their enemy, someone they needed but hated? The railroads, which they depended on, as did other businessmen, but felt cheated by on prices. There had been demands to regulate the railroads for years, but the Interstate Commerce Commission had really done almost nothing, and the Granger laws had been struck down by the Supreme Court. But with Roosevelt as president, the Interstate Commerce Commission, first of all, was pushed to do more. And Congress passed two important laws to regulate the railroads. The Elkins Act of 1903 outlawed rebates, so that you couldn't give a favored company a refund of part of their shipping rates. And it fined anyone who tried to offer or accept a rebate. The Hepburn Act of 1906 went quite a bit further. It gave the Interstate Commerce Commission real power to limit prices on shipping costs for railroads, but also for ferry boats, toll bridges, and oil pipelines, and to investigate transport companies' records. Although the Hepburn Act did not cover a form of transportation that at the time was pretty minimal, but today is very important. And of course, that was trucking. One reason that transporting things by truck became so significant was because those weren't covered by the Hepburn Act. Although, of course, too, just because shipping by road is more convenient in many ways than shipping by rail or water. Now, there had, in theory, been laws, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, to regulate and limit trusts, but they had never really been applied until 1904, when the Supreme Court declared a group called the Northern Securities Company, or Northern Securities Trust, which owned several railroads in the northern U.S. and ran them really as one regional monopoly. The Supreme Court declared this trust to be illegal, and Roosevelt forced this trust to break back up into smaller railroads that would have to compete. And the legal cases surrounding the busting of the Northern Securities Trust also formed the basis of many later antitrust lawsuits. Because in a country with English law, as we have, a big part of legal decisions is based on the precedents set by earlier court decisions. And busting up the Northern Securities Company was a pretty big deal because it was owned by a number of big businessmen, some of the most influential men of the day, like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and some other major robber barons were the owners of this company. But Roosevelt showed that he would do what needed to be done to bust the trusts. And so Roosevelt got a reputation as a trust buster, although it was not quite that simple, as he made a distinction between what he described as good trusts and bad trusts. Some trusts, he said, did operate fairly, did not necessarily cheat consumers. Some trusts, he said, even served an important public purpose. And so some trusts were left alone. Some trusts even formed or grew during his presidency. And the decision between what was a good trust and a bad trust was made by Roosevelt himself. The most famous example of a good trust was formed during the Panic of 1907, when the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company was about to go under. The failure of this large company, a major employer in the Southeast, would just make the recession worse. But J.P. Morgan, who was buying up a lot of stocks to prop up the stock market and get control of companies cheap, was prepared to buy up Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad stock and keep the company going by absorbing it into his current steel trust, U.S. Steel. Many people assumed Roosevelt would block this vast expansion of what was already our hugest company, U.S. Steel, but Roosevelt felt that keeping this employer afloat in the South would serve the public interest, and he very publicly gave his blessing to this merger, to the surprise of many people. Roosevelt loved to read. He was a speed reader, and one of many things he read was The Jungle. And after reading that, while he thought Upton Sinclair himself was a bit sensationalistic and inclined to exaggerate, he still insisted on reform in helping to create the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. Roosevelt, as we've mentioned, was a great lover of the outdoors. He said hunting and camping and fishing kept a man healthy and manly. Indeed, he felt that there were so many luxuries in the 20th century that America was facing a crisis of manhood, and we had to do what we could to keep our men manly. And he, of course, had enjoyed the outdoors, and he wanted to make sure future generations could benefit from them as he had. He also did view the outdoors as a source of natural resources, but a source that should be managed rather than all exploited at once. And so he vastly expanded America's national park system and also created national forests and what he called national monuments, which were more protected land. Now, he did not invent national parks. The first national park in the U.S., indeed the first national park in the world, was designated as such in 1872 by Ulysses S. Grant, that being Yellowstone National Park. Over the next couple decades, 3 more national parks were created. Yosemite, Sequoia, and Mount Rainier national parks had already been dedicated by the time Roosevelt became president. But in addition to these national parks, Roosevelt went aside to create many more. If we count national parks, national forests, and national monuments together, Roosevelt protected not just more land than any other president, but more land than all other presidents combined, a total of 125 million acres. In doing this, he was inspired by the ideas of John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot, in particular, would become one of his closest advisors on conservation, which is to say, carefully using natural resources. He was not opposed, say, to some logging in national forests, as long as it was done carefully and the forests weren't clear-cut. He wasn't opposed to some mining, as long as, again, it was done carefully. Whereas John Muir was a preservationist, finding a spiritual value in untainted wilderness. Again, Roosevelt was more a conservationist, wanting to preserve but also carefully use our natural resources. And Gifford Pinchot, and his main advisor, was made the first head of the U.S. Forest Service when Roosevelt created that in 1905. Now, having ranched out west, Roosevelt understood that one of the big problems of the western U.S. is lack of access to water. Here in East Tennessee, we don't think much about water. It just falls from the sky. There's rivers and lakes all over the place. But out west, water can be pretty scarce. Some of the range wars were over access to water rights. States created treaties between themselves. There's a huge treaty dating to the early 20th century between all the states the Colorado River flows through, as well as the Republic of Mexico, over how much water each of those states and Mexico can take out of the Colorado River, so there will be enough for everybody. although, unfortunately, when they devised that treaty, the last several years it had above average rainfall, so they actually apportioned more water than there usually is in the Colorado River. To deal with this issue of water rights out west, Roosevelt supported the Newlands Reclamation Act, named after a Senator Newlands, sometimes also called the National Reclamation Act, passed in 1902, which gave the U.S. government control over western water rights and gave it the power to improve irrigation systems and to build dams, to create reservoirs, to keep water around, and to create electricity. As many of those dams would be hydroelectric dams, although it didn't begin during his lifetime. One of the dams created under this law, the Hoover Dam, would at the time it was built be the largest dam in the world, and of course remained a tourist attraction out west, part of the legacy of the Newlands Reclamation Act. And under Roosevelt, America became much more active in foreign policy, especially around the Caribbean, which he came to describe, or some came to describe, as an American lake. Roosevelt's foreign policy is sometimes described as big stick diplomacy, as he was willing to use force if necessary, at least deemed necessary by him, as were presidents to come. And Roosevelt saw himself as Latin America's policeman, which is not entirely a new idea. Some previous presidents had, of course, used the Monroe Doctrine, our promise to protect countries in the Western Hemisphere from outsiders, as kind of an excuse to step into Latin American countries that might invite outside aggression if they were unstable. But that had not happened a whole lot. Under Roosevelt, though, we would go much further, as Roosevelt would describe what's been called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. A corollary, of course, being a term in mathematics for a rule that is naturally derived from another rule. Roosevelt's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine was that not only would the U.S. protect Latin American countries from outsiders, we would also protect them from themselves, stepping into countries experiencing instability. In particular, he worried about Latin American countries going into debt to European countries, because over the 1800s, many European countries had used debt in smaller countries as an excuse to invade and take those countries over when they didn't pay up. And Roosevelt didn't want that happening in the Caribbean. Latin Americans, Roosevelt said, simply couldn't take care of themselves properly, needed to be lifted up by a more civilized nation. And if we don't do it, some European country will. One of the first places American force was used to provide stability, or so Roosevelt said, was in Panama, which in those days was a region of the larger country of Colombia. And in Panama, a French company had been working for years to build a canal across Central America, but they kept dying of yellow fever, and the company was about bankrupt. Indeed, America worked out a deal to purchase the company that had the right to build the canal, but would also need permission from the Colombian government to continue construction. Colombia's government at first negotiated, and Roosevelt offered them a moderately large cash payment, but Colombia decided it wasn't enough. And suddenly, a revolution broke out in Panama, with one of its leaders being a French engineer with a big investment in the company the U.S. was about to buy. Immediately after the revolution broke out, an American gunboat, USS Nashville, showed up off the coast to support the revolution and prevent Colombia sending any more troops into Panama. And the revolution succeeded. Right afterwards, the United States and Panama signed the Hay-Bunau-Varilla Treaty, Bunau-Varilla being the French engineer who stood to profit a lot by selling the canal company, to the U.S. In fact, he funded the entire revolution out of his own pocket. And under this treaty, the United States gave the new Republic of Panama $10 million for the right to build the canal, plus $250,000 rent each year for as long as we wanted to rent it. And we would not just build and control the canal, we would also control a 10-mile wide strip of land, a canal zone, letting us control and land on either side of the canal. People born in that zone would be considered American citizens. And incidentally, this was the same amount of money the U.S. had offered Panama or Colombia not long before. And the United States would control the canal zone from 1903 to 1979, the canal itself until the very last moment of 1999. The biggest problem facing workers was disease, particularly malaria and yellow fever, which are transmitted by mosquitoes. Eventually, the U.S. Army found ways to deal with the mosquitoes, draining swamps, preventing workers from leaving outstanding water. Used to be workers around the canal set their beds in little dishes of water, so each bed leg was standing in a small bowl of water. That kept ants from crawling up the beds and biting them. But the mosquitoes were even worse. And with mosquitoes under control, the Panama Canal, which Roosevelt visited during its construction and played with a steam shovel, was finished in 1914, finally giving the world what we had wanted since the days of Columbus, an all-water route to Asia. And during and after Roosevelt's presidency, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the U.S. would also intervene several times in Cuba, as well as in Nicaragua, and in Haiti, and in the Dominican Republic, in the name of stability and security. And Roosevelt would also go further afield, not just protecting our lake in the Caribbean, to deal, among others, with Japan. Now in 1904, early one Sunday morning, the Japanese staged a sneak attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet in Vladivostok, catching the fleet off guard and totally destroying it. And being so pleased with the idea of an early morning sneak attack, they kept that in mind in case they might want to do that again in, say, 37 years. This was the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, in which the Japanese invaded Russia's territory in the east, moved into Russia's sphere of influence in China, of course destroyed Russia's Pacific Fleet. Russia did have 2 other fleets, though. And their Baltic Fleet sailed all the way around the world, around Africa, through the Indian Ocean, up the Western Pacific, until the Japanese totally destroyed it off the coast of Korea. The Russian people were terrified and furious, rebelling against a government they viewed as corrupt and incompetent in the Russian Revolution of 1905. Which the Tsar of Russia was able to barely contain after promising reforms to the Russian people. Reforms that, in fact, were only superficially carried out. This really worried Roosevelt. He worried about the rise of the Japanese Empire. The U.S., of course, had some territory in the Pacific ourselves. He worried, too, about the destabilization of Russia, the largest country on Earth. And so, Roosevelt offered to negotiate between the 2 countries, inviting diplomats from both to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where they worked out the Treaty of Portsmouth, bringing the war to a close. And with Japan gaining a little bit of land from Russia and Russia's sphere of influence in China, Japan had hoped to get more and was a little bit put out. The Russians, of course, were sorry to have lost anything, and really they were probably lucky not to lose more. This treaty was viewed as so significant that Theodore Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in response, the first American to receive that award. And also, Russia's poor performance in the Russo-Japanese War would convince their neighbors to the west, Germany and Austria-Hungary, that Russia was weak, something that will matter again here in about 9 years. And to show off America's growing power, Roosevelt had 16 of our modern steel-plated, steam-powered battleships painted bright white, and sent them with a number of escort ships on which they called the Great White Fleet, on a goodwill tour around the world, from December of 1907 to February of 1909, visiting countries all around the planet to show off our power, but a goodwill tour to show that we mean it peacefully. Although if anyone doesn't feel peaceful, we do have all these battleships to back it up. The third largest navy on Earth. But now, while the fleet was sailing around the world, Roosevelt made an important decision. In 1908, Roosevelt had served almost 2 terms, excluding a few months of McKinley's presidency. And if 2 terms was good enough for George Washington, it was good enough for Theodore Roosevelt. So he declared he would not run for re-election, encouraged Americans to vote for his Secretary of War and former governor of the Philippines, William Howard Taft, which they did, defeating William Jennings Bryan in his 3rd and last run for the presidency in the election of 1908. And Roosevelt understood that he was a big personality and did not want to overwhelm Taft. And so Roosevelt went on African safari, funded by a couple museums and several nature magazines. He wrote articles on a portable typewriter for the nature magazines, and shot all kinds of wild animals to provide specimens for the museums, who spent decades stuffing them all. There were so many. On his adventure, he even blew up a hippopotamus with dynamite, although later felt bad because it was a female hippopotamus. But to be fair, it was 2 tons and was charging at him. Although we think of the hippopotamus as cute, it's actually the deadliest animal in Africa, killing more people than lions, or rhinoceroses or elephants. From Africa, he went to Europe, where he met many of the kings and emperors of Europe. There he is spending a day riding around with the Emperor of Germany, Roosevelt being fluent in German as well as English, French, and Italian. They took pictures. Later, the Emperor mailed him the pictures with cute captions written on the back in German, kind of the 1910 version of Facebook. While in Europe, he picked up his Nobel Peace Prize and eventually returned to the United States after attending the funeral of King Edward VII of Britain. And this did give Taft some room to work. And at first, Taft did many of the same things Roosevelt had done, but eventually kind of took his own course. At first, he kept on Roosevelt's former advisors, but later came to argue with some of them, and even fired a couple men whom Roosevelt thought very highly of. He lowered tariffs. Progressives in general wanted lower tariffs, and Taft supported the lower Payne-Aldrich Tariff, but it was not as low as most progressives wanted, and there were some loopholes in it as well, letting some big businesses still be protected by big tariffs. He also went after trusts. But whereas Roosevelt had said there were good trusts and there were bad trusts, and had gone with his heart, Taft by profession was a lawyer and had no heart. No, I kid, of course. Rather, as a lawyer, he said there's not good trusts and bad trusts. There are legal trusts and illegal trusts. And he busted a lot of them. Indeed, Taft in one term busted twice as many trusts as Roosevelt did in 2 terms. It would be Taft who would bust up Standard Oil. But in believing there were legal trusts and illegal trusts, he also tried to prevent U.S. Steel from buying up the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, which Roosevelt had said a couple years before they could do, but the merger process had been slow, and Taft now tried to stop it. In the end, U.S. Steel did buy the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, but was forced to operate it as a separate company for many years. And yet, Taft did not bust every monopoly, and so some people came to view him as being soft on the rich and big business. Although, for maybe being soft, it would be Taft who would be president when an income tax would become possible again. There had been an income tax during the Civil War, but a few years after the Civil War ended, the income tax was ended. There was an attempt to recreate the income tax in the 1890s, but the U.S. Supreme Court had struck it down, saying an income tax is unconstitutional. But if something's unconstitutional, but we still really, really want to do it, what can we do? We could do it, and some people do just ignore the Constitution. But if we want to follow the Constitution, but it doesn't say what we want it to say, what can we do to the Constitution?
Oh, amend it.
Amend the Constitution. And so, while we skipped over the first of the 4 progressive amendments, the 16th Amendment, ratified in 1913, during the last month of Taft's presidency, allowed Congress to create an income tax, making it part of the Constitution. And Congress created, by today's standards, a pretty low tax. The wealthiest 1% of Americans had to pay an income tax between 1 and 7% of their income. I believe the top tax bracket consisted entirely of John Jacob Astor IV. And Taft did finally get a lower tariff created, the Underwood Tariff, created very early in 1913, again, the last couple months of his presidency. Now, Taft did differ a bit from Roosevelt in terms of diplomacy, too, as he kind of put the big stick away, preferring what's been described as dollar diplomacy, encouraging American companies to invest in Latin American businesses, like oil in Mexico and Venezuela, sugar and banana plantations in the Caribbean and Central America. Although if a business really had trouble, Taft was willing to pull the big stick back out. But as we've seen earlier, the banana companies could sometimes take care of themselves, overthrowing, for example, the government of Honduras. So, Taft did some Rooseveltian things, but disagreed with him some too. And I think, too, as much as I hate to say it, Roosevelt just missed being the center of attention. His daughter Alice once said of him that he was the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. And I think he missed that. And so he began to criticize Taft very publicly, eventually going on a speaking tour to promote an idea he called the New Nationalism, a program to make the U.S. government even more powerful so it could bust more trusts and act more progressive reforms. And in 1912, Roosevelt personally attended the Republican National Convention, which it was seen in the past as a little bit inappropriate for possible candidates to do. He wanted to get the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1912. Sure, he'd served 2 terms, but he's taken a term off, and he's ready to go again. But while Taft was fairly progressive, moderates and conservatives in the Republican Party felt he would be better for them than Roosevelt, and although it was a close thing, Taft got the nomination to run for re-election. And so, Roosevelt and progressive Republicans and some progressive Democrats simply went off and formed their own party, the Progressive Party, nominating Theodore Roosevelt and marching out of the convention hall singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers." But there are some people who questioned Roosevelt. He was not in the same health he'd once been in. He'd broken a leg when his carriage was hit by a trolley in 1902. One time a Navy man, I think, someone from the military, visited the White House. He was also a famous boxer. And Roosevelt said, "Hey, I used to box at Harvard. You want to go around?" And the guy ended up hitting Roosevelt so hard it blinded him in one eye. So people did question his health a bit. Also, though muscular in his youth, he'd gone a bit to flab in his 50s. But he said, "Not to worry. I feel as fit as a bull moose." And so the Progressive Party was typically known as the Bull Moose Party. The Progressives, incidentally, went on to found a magazine of their own, as groups did in those days, called the New Republic, founded in 1914 to promote progressive views, and they are still published today, a very left-leaning publication. Now, while running for president, Theodore Roosevelt, in October, was about to give a speech, go into a theater or an auditorium to give a speech, but while out back preparing to go in, he was approached by a man who was haunted by the ghost of President McKinley. He pulled out a pistol and shot Roosevelt in the chest. The bullet went through his overcoat, through his regular coat, through the 50-page speech he had prepared and folded double. Roosevelt was blind as a bat even before the boxer knocked out one of his eyes, and so he had a thick case of spare glasses. The bullet went through his steel glasses case and all his spare glasses, through his vest, through his shirt, and finally into his chest. Now, most presidential candidates, if they were shot in the chest, would be discouraged and would do what his advisors said and maybe go to the hospital or something. But Roosevelt said, "No, I came to give a speech. I'm going to give a speech." He went into the auditorium, pulled back his coat to show the blood spreading over his shirt, and said, "I don't know if you realize this, but I have been shot." Then he apologized that he would give a slightly shorter speech because his actual speech had been shot through, and he showed it with the bullets in it, bullet holes in it. But he still gave a speech, and then finally went to the hospital. And he did have to spend a week there before going back to campaign. In the election of 1912, there would be a fourth candidate, as Eugene V. Debs ran for the Socialist Party for the fourth, but not last time. But in the election of 1912, Debs did not win, of course, nor did Taft or Roosevelt, the two of them splitting the Republican vote, with moderate and conservative Republicans tending to favor Taft, progressive Republicans, and some progressive Democrats voting for Roosevelt. Roosevelt getting enough support that Taft came third in the popular and electoral vote, the only time one of the two major parties has come in third. So with the Republican vote split, the Democrats won the presidency for only the second time since the Civil War, electing a progressive Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, moving him away from the governor's mansion in New Jersey. Now, after this, Theodore Roosevelt, in his retirement, did as you should do, go to Brazil and explore an 800-mile-long tributary of the Amazon River, previously known as the River of Doubt, because while they knew where it started and they thought they knew where it ended, nobody knew what was in the middle. He started off with over 100 men. About a dozen made it to the end, most quitting early on, but some dying of disease, some being killed by Stone Age Indians who'd never seen a white man before. Two of them going crazy and killing some other members of the expedition, but later being allowed to rejoin the expedition. They were too scared to be in the jungle, and they needed everybody they could to paddle the boat. When Roosevelt described this afterwards to, I think, the National Geographic Society, they thought he was making it up, until the Brazilian army confirmed it had really happened, and Brazil renamed the river Rio Roosevelt.
That's still the name of it.
That's still the name of it. Big Bill Taft, who'd always been a large man, as a stress eater got to about 350 pounds while president, such that according to legend, probably not true, he got stuck in the White House bathtub, and they did install a larger bathtub that they photographed 3 workmen sitting in at once. Following the presidency, went on a low-carb diet, got back to his college weight of 240, and in the 1920s, finally achieved what he really wanted and was named Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the only president to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Indeed, in that role, he would later swear in 2 presidents with their oath of office. And he played a role in getting the Supreme Court their own building. Prior to that, they met in the basement of the Capitol building, although he didn't live to see the Supreme Court move into their new building in 1935, having died in 1930, 11 years after Theodore Roosevelt, who died relatively young, they say of a broken heart, both partly from his weight, partly all the coffee, and also when his youngest son was killed in the First World War. But he died in his sleep. A friend said death had to come for him sleeping. If he'd come for him awake, there would have been a fight. That leaves Woodrow Wilson as President of the United States. Previously, he had been president of Princeton University. He was a college professor. His only other political office had been governor of New Jersey, having been chosen by the New Jersey Democratic machine, hoping he would be their puppet and give the appearance of honesty. But once governor, he really tried to govern honestly, tried to clean up machine corruption, and so they pushed him off into the presidency to get him out of New Jersey. But while he was from New Jersey at the time, he was born in the South and had many Southern attitudes. He's the first Southern president since Andrew Johnson, the first Southerner elected president since Zachary Taylor. And he too was a progressive and called his domestic policy the New Freedom, and said he would attack the triple wall of privilege, the trusts, the tariffs, and high finance. To help him bust trusts, he created the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 to regulate competition and, for the first time, try to regulate advertising. In the same year, 1914, Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, further expanding the power of antitrust laws. And it also recognized unions as not being trusts. After all, the Sherman Antitrust Act had been used early on against the American Railway Union, saying that the ARU had a monopoly on the supply of railroad workers. The Clayton Antitrust Act specifically says unions aren't monopolies, but it does give the government the power to go after others. Because of its recognition of unions, head of the American Federation of Labor, Samuel Gompers, called this labor's Magna Carta. Farmers had asked for help for years, and in 1916, the Federal Farm Loan Act let farmers borrow federal money. In 1916 as well, the Working Man's Compensation Act created disability insurance plans for federal employees. So if you were hurt on the job working for the U.S. government, although I'm not sure how you'd lose your arm working in an office, if you did, you got disability benefits. And that was later expanded to cover private employers as well. People wanted the railroads regulated and had wanted a shorter working day. And the Adamson Act of 1916 established an 8-hour day and overtime pay for interstate railroad workers, because clearly the government can at least regulate something crossing state lines. In the first 8-hour workday, although 8-hour workdays would really become common during the Great Depression, when employers, starting with Henry Ford, wanted to keep their workers around but not pay them for as many hours. As president, Wilson appointed the first Jewish member of the U.S. Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, already a distinguished lawyer. Wilson lowered tariffs even more than Roosevelt or Taft. In 1913, Wilson created the Federal Reserve System, placing national banks under the control of a Federal Reserve Board, which set up regional Federal Reserve banks to hold reserves for other banks, essentially serving as a bank for the banks. That way, a bank's money would mostly be in their local Federal Reserve Bank. If there was a run on the bank would have money somewhere else. In a crisis, perhaps the Federal Reserve System could even lend money to struggling banks to keep them afloat, thus replacing the national banking system created during the Civil War and, of course, the Bank of the United States, held by Andrew Jackson. When it came to labor disputes, Wilson often sided with the workers, although not always. Coal miners in Colorado went on strike in 1914, and the Colorado National Guard went in to break the strike, resulting in the Ludlow Massacre, in which the Colorado National Guard shot into the tents of the strikers and set them on fire, killing 26 people, most of them the wives and children of the striking miners. The U.S. Army then went in to kind of try to calm things down a little and end the strike, but at least without killing women and children, as the National Guard had done. The deadliest labor dispute of the 20th century. And while Wilson was president, the other 3 progressive amendments that we've already mentioned were ratified. The 17th Amendment, directly electing senators, the 18th Amendment, banning alcohol, and the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, which Wilson had at various points both supported and opposed, but again finally came to support again. And in terms of diplomacy, Wilson will not speak of big stick diplomacy or dollar diplomacy, but moral diplomacy. He says he will convince Latin American countries to live up to American standards. In a way, this is progressive reform on a world stage. But Wilson was perfectly willing to use the military too. In 1915, he was worried that either France or Germany might invade Haiti, which owed both of them money. So, before they could do that, Wilson sent in the Marines to protect Haiti from Germany and France, and of course, themselves, whether they liked it or not. In 1913, the Mexican Revolution was underway, having begun in 1910, when Porfirio Diaz, who had ruled Mexico as president or really dictator for many decades, was forced to agree to retire. But 2 years after that, the new president was overthrown by Victoriano Huerta. In 1913, the Mexican general Victoriano Huerta overthrew the president of Mexico, had him executed, and declared himself president. He promised to protect American investments, but Wilson felt it was wrong to murder presidents. And so, for the sake of moral diplomacy, he sent the Marines into Mexico to punish Huerta, and also to occupy a couple cities so the Germans couldn't ship weapons to Huerta. Wilson said, I'm going to teach the South American republics to elect good men. And Wilson did work with local Mexican revolutionaries fighting against Huerta. What's often referred to as the Mexican Revolution, in many ways was a civil war. And Wilson would support two leaders, Pancho Villa, a revolutionary leader and bandit chief based in northern Mexico, and Venustiano Caranza, based more in southern and central Mexico. And eventually they would win. Caranza would become president, and then he and Pancho Villa would have a bit of a falling out. And the U.S. would have to decide which to support, and ultimately decided that we would support Caranza. At which point, Pancho Villa invaded the United States, launching 3 different raids over the border, killing 24 Americans, most of them civilians, in southwestern border towns. And so in response, Wilson sent Black Jack Pershing, veteran of the Spanish-American War, the Philippine insurrection, into Mexico with 10,000 troops in a punitive expedition to punish Mexico for Pancho Villa's actions. They chased him around Mexico from 1916 to 1917, but never captured him, although he was assassinated in 1923 by some of his own enemies within Mexico. We did pull the punitive expedition back out of Mexico in 1917 when we would have to send men into World War I, which we'll look at more tomorrow. Also in 1917, the United States bought the Danish Virgin Islands. Britain owned some of them, but Denmark had owned others for centuries. We purchased them for $25 million, partly out of fear that if we didn't, Germany might. And during World War I, we didn't want a German naval base in the American Lake of the Caribbean. And today, the Federal Reserve System still governs our economy. The government oversees many aspects of trade and business and unions. We have food safety laws, workplace safety laws, and other laws meant to protect workers and consumers dating to the Progressive period. On the other hand, the government's much bigger, much more expensive, much more involved in people's lives than it was in the 1800s. For good or bad, or both, we live today in a world created by the Progressives.